My name is Eleanor Hayes, and on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Willow Creek, Oregon, I learned what it feels like to be erased inside your own home. The kettle had just begun to sing, filling the kitchen with that soft, familiar hiss that always made me think of winter mornings with my late husband, Thomas. The sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin golden lines, dust swirling gently in its path. Everything looked the same: the floral mugs, the clock above the stove, the framed wedding photo that had hung in that very spot for 43 years. But that morning, something shifted in the air, like the world had tilted just slightly out of place. Madison was standing by the counter, one manicured hand resting on the refrigerator handle as if she owned it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words slid through the stillness like a knife through silk. "If you don't like living with us, you can leave." Just like that. 7 words that sliced through 40 years of motherhood, sacrifice, and patience. I looked at her, my daughter-in-law, 29 years old, flawless in her pressed beige sweater, the kind of woman who smiled for photographs but never for people. Her tone wasn't angry. It was almost detached, like she was reciting a fact that had been decided long ago. Across the table, my son Ryan looked down at his phone. His thumbs froze mid-scroll. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. The silence between us was thicker than grief. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. For a moment, I could only hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator, the one I'd bought the year Thomas retired. The same one Madison now leaned against like a queen in her kingdom. That sentence echoed in my mind, over and over. "If you don't like living with us, living with us." I felt something twist inside me. When did the language change? When did my house, the home Thomas and I built from the first down payment to the final shingle, become theirs? When did I, the owner, become the guest? It wasn't fear that paralyzed me. It was recognition. I wasn't living with them. They were living off me. The realization hit with a quiet, humiliating clarity. I turned toward the framed wedding photo on the counter. The glass caught the glow of the oven light, and for a moment, I saw the reflection of the woman I used to be: young, hopeful, full of plans. Thomas stood behind her in the picture, his hand on her shoulder, smiling that gentle smile that always made me feel safe. Now the photo looked faded, its silver frame dulled by years of fingerprints and steam. The love it captured seemed like a relic from another lifetime. I wanted to say something, to reclaim even a sliver of dignity, but my throat felt tight. Madison watched me with that faint smirk people wear when they know they've already won. Ryan finally looked up, but not at me, past me, as if I were part of the wallpaper. "Excuse me?" I whispered, my voice smaller than I intended. "You heard me," Madison replied, still calm. "No one's forcing you to stay here if you don't want to. It's just not healthy for anyone when there's tension." Tension. That's what she called it. I called it betrayal, wearing a polite smile. I thought Ryan might step in, say something, remind his wife whose house this was, but he didn't. He rubbed the back of his neck and muttered, "Maybe we all just need some space, Mom." That word, Mom, had never felt so distant. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. Not here. Not in this kitchen where I taught Ryan how to make pancakes when he was 7. Not in this house where Thomas and I spent our last Christmas together. The tea kettle whistled sharply, a sound too bright for a moment so dark. I turned it off, my hand trembling slightly, and stared out the window. The maple tree in the yard was losing its leaves. Golden fragments fell slowly, one by one, until the branches stood bare against the gray Oregon sky. Maybe that was what was happening to me. Piece by piece, they were stripping me of everything that made this house mine, my habits, my furniture, my place at the table. Even my silence was being used against me. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just felt the air grow colder around me, as though the house itself had taken sides. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, I understood what real loneliness felt like. It wasn't about being alone. It was about being unseen in a room full of people who used to love you. I picked up the framed wedding photo and wiped the glass with the edge of my sleeve. "You wouldn't believe what they've turned our home into, Thomas," I whispered. The words caught in my throat, soft and cracked. The kitchen light flickered once before steadying again. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was a sign. I set the photo back on the counter and took a slow breath. Something inside me shifted, not rage exactly, but something colder, sharper, a seed of defiance. If Madison thought she could erase me, she hadn't met the woman Thomas used to call the quiet storm. I'd spent decades keeping peace, smoothing arguments, forgiving disrespect, but even storms learn patience before they break. I turned back to Madison, who was now pouring herself coffee from the pot I'd brewed. She didn't look up. Neither did Ryan. The two of them stood there like the rightful owners of a kingdom they didn't build. The silence between us stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, I said softly, "You're right, Madison." Her eyes flicked up, curious. "Maybe it's time for a change." I smiled, small, controlled, the kind of smile that hides a storm behind calm water. Inside, I was already planning. I didn't know what my next step would be, but I knew this. I would not leave empty-handed. The old Eleanor might have packed her bags and apologized for causing trouble, but that woman was gone. I stood in the golden light of my kitchen, my hand resting on the wedding photo. Its reflection shimmered against the counter like a ghost of the past watching quietly. They thought I was defeated. They were wrong. If you've ever been made to feel small in your own home, stay. This story might just speak your truth. Welcome to Grandma's final chapter, where silence finds its voice and where every forgotten woman learns to rise again. Subscribe, share, and join us here, because sometimes the bravest act of love is choosing yourself. I closed the kitchen door behind me and walked down the narrow hallway that led to what Madison liked to call my suite. The word always made me laugh, quietly and without humor. It wasn't a suite. It was a storage room that she had cleared out, painted a shade of cream too pale to feel warm, and decorated with furniture she no longer wanted in the rest of the house. There were no locks on the door. Madison had once said it was for safety, in case I fell or needed help. But deep down, I knew the truth. The absence of a lock wasn't about protection. It was about control. The room smelled faintly of dust and lavender, a ghost of the sachets I used to tuck in my drawers when Thomas was alive. The single lamp on the nightstand flickered, its bulb stuttering like a tired heartbeat. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint murmur of voices from downstairs. Their laughter, their footsteps, the clink of dishes in my kitchen, that was the part that hurt the most. They laughed. They laughed as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just pushed me to the edge of my own life. On the small wooden desk near the window sat my old leather notebook. Thomas had given it to me on our 25th anniversary. "For your thoughts," he'd said, smiling in that easy way he always did. "You're a woman who notices things, Ellie. You should write them down." I hadn't opened it in years. I picked it up now, the cover soft and worn, the spine cracked from old use. When I ran my fingers along its surface, I could almost feel the warmth of his hands, the way he used to hold mine when words weren't enough. I flipped it open. The pages still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The last entry was dated 3 months after his death. My handwriting was shaky, uncertain, as if the pen itself had been grieving. I turned to a blank page. The paper was yellowed slightly at the edges, like old skin. Slowly, I wrote down the sentence Madison had thrown at me just an hour earlier. "If you don't like living with us, you can leave." Each word sank into the page like a wound reopening. I stared at the line for a long time, letting the ink dry before turning the pen over in my hand. Was this really what my life had become? A guest in a house I built. A burden in the home where I once sang lullabies to my son. It was strange, the way dignity could be taken piece by piece. No one storms in and steals it from you. They just stop saying thank you. They rearrange your furniture. They start calling your home their space. And before you know it, you're apologizing for existing too loudly. I looked around the room. The curtains were new Madison's choice, beige linen that matched her endless obsession with neutral tones. The dresser had been moved so the mirror no longer faced the window. She said it reflected too much sunlight in the mornings. But I missed that light. It had been my companion in the quiet hours before dawn. Everything about this room felt temporary, as if I were staying at a motel and expected to check out soon. No photographs, no books, no traces of the woman who had spent 4 decades turning this house into a home. I poured myself a cup of tea from the tray I'd carried upstairs earlier. It was cold now, a thin film forming on the surface. I didn't bother to warm it. Instead, I held the cup in both hands, feeling the chill seep into my skin. When Thomas was alive, he used to say the house had a heartbeat. Every creak, every sigh of the wood at night, it was alive because we were alive. Sitting there now, I realized that heartbeat had stopped. The walls were quiet. The house was still. I pressed the pen to the paper again. I have become an unpaid tenant in my own life. The words looked almost poetic in their cruelty. Downstairs, I heard Ryan's voice, muffled through the walls. He was laughing at something Madison said. That sound used to make me happy. I used to love hearing my son's laughter drift up the stairs, proof that he was safe and home. But tonight, it felt like a betrayal. I wondered if Thomas would have recognized the man Ryan had become, the quiet compliance, the way he avoided confrontation at any cost. Maybe he thought he was keeping the peace. But what kind of peace requires the silencing of your own mother? I looked out the window. The yard was dark except for the faint glow of the porch light. The oak tree Thomas had planted when Ryan was born stood tall, its branches reaching toward the sky like tired arms. It had survived storms, winters, and summers of relentless heat. It had bent, but it hadn't broken. I envied that tree. I turned back to my notebook and wrote another line. They can silence my voice, but they can't rewrite the truth. The act of writing steadied me. Each word was an anchor pulling me back toward myself. I hadn't realized how far I drifted from the woman I used to be. I had spent so long trying to keep the peace that I'd forgotten how to defend my own space. I took a deep breath and flipped back through the earlier pages of the notebook, rereading fragments of old thoughts, lists of things to fix around the house, grocery notes, poems I'd copied from books I loved. I found one that Thomas had written on the inside cover. For Ellie. So you never stop noticing the world, even when it stops noticing you. That sentence undid me. For the first time in months, I cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears that traced the lines of my face. I wasn't crying for what Madison had said. I was crying because I realized how long it had been since anyone saw me the way Thomas did. The tears didn't feel weak. They felt cleansing. When I finally closed the notebook, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't powerless. Not yet. There was still something inside me that Madison couldn't take: memory, truth, and the quiet knowledge of ownership. This house had my fingerprints in every beam and nail, my laughter in every corner, my love in every wall. They could repaint it, rearrange it, rename it, but they couldn't erase me from it. I placed the notebook on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like waiting. And as I lay there listening to the faint hum of their voices downstairs, I whispered to myself, "You're not finished yet, Eleanor. You're just beginning to remember who you are." The room had no locks, but for the first time, I realized that the key had always been mine. 9 months. That is how long it took for me to vanish. Not in a single moment, but in pieces like dust brushed quietly from a shelf until only emptiness remained. When Ryan and Madison first moved in, I told myself it would be temporary. He had just lost his job at the engineering firm, and she had cut back her hours at the salon. "Just until we get back on our feet, Mom," Ryan had said, his voice boyish and hopeful. I had smiled then, believing in him the way mothers do, even when reason warns them not to. For the first few weeks, the house felt alive again. There was laughter in the kitchen, the smell of dinner shared around the table, even a hint of warmth that I hadn't felt since Thomas passed. I remember thinking, this is what family is for. But by the 3rd month, that illusion began to unravel. Madison had ideas. Modernizing, she called it. She replaced the curtains with beige linen panels, threw out my floral tablecloth, and covered the old oak chair, Thomas's chair, with a gray blanket. "It doesn't fit the aesthetic," she said, snapping photos for her online decor blog. I wanted to tell her that some things don't need to fit. Some things belong simply because they hold history, but I bit my tongue. I became careful with my footsteps, like a guest afraid to overstay her welcome. I learned which drawers were theirs and which cabinets I could still open without complaint. The kitchen, once my sanctuary, had become Madison's domain. She labeled shelves and organized the spices alphabetically. I was allowed to cook, but only if I cleaned as I went. I started making my meals in the evenings, after they went upstairs to watch television, eating alone in the quiet light of the refrigerator. It is strange how a house can grow smaller without changing size. I paid the utilities, the groceries, even the mortgage when Ryan's savings ran out. Every month, I'd transfer money from my retirement account to cover the bills. "We'll pay you back soon," Ryan always said, avoiding my eyes. But I stopped asking. A mother doesn't keep score. Still, There were moments, small, sharp ones, when I could feel myself fading. One afternoon, I found Madison in the living room, rearranging the furniture. She had moved Thomas's bookshelf to the garage and replaced it with a glass cabinet filled with scented candles and framed prints of words like gratitude and serenity. When I asked about the bookshelf, she smiled sweetly. "Oh, I thought we'd store it for now. It's a bit heavy looking." Heavy looking. That was her word for anything that carried memory. I went to the garage that evening. The bookshelf stood beside a stack of unused boxes, its wood dulled by dust. And there, beside it, was Thomas's chair covered with an old sheet. The sight of it stopped me cold. That chair had once been the heart of our evenings. Thomas would sit there reading, while Ryan, small and freckled, drew pictures on the rug. I used to watch them from the kitchen doorway, the lamplight turning the scene into something sacred. Now, it looked like a forgotten relic. I reached out and touched the armrest. The wood was cool under my fingers, and for a moment I imagined I could still feel the warmth of Thomas's hand where it used to rest. I wanted to cry, but instead I whispered to the empty garage, "I see you. I haven't forgotten." The next morning, Madison complained that I'd left fingerprints on the sheet. She began holding small gatherings on weekends, book club, wine tastings, wellness nights. I was never invited. "You wouldn't enjoy it, Eleanor. It's mostly my age group," she'd say, smiling as if she were sparing me from discomfort. I stayed upstairs, listening to their laughter drift up the staircase. Once, when I went down to fetch a cup of tea, one of Madison's friends mistook me for her cleaning lady. Madison didn't correct her. After that, I stopped coming downstairs when she had company. Ryan noticed my absence one night while we were both in the kitchen. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, the glow from the refrigerator painting him in pale light. "Mom, please," he said softly. "Don't make things tense. She's trying." "Trying?" I repeated. The word felt foreign in my mouth. "Trying to erase me?" He rubbed his forehead. "It's just a different style. You know how she is about order." I wanted to shout. I wanted to ask him if order was more important than respect. But when I looked at him, I saw a boy again, small and lost, caught between his mother and the woman he thought he needed to protect. So I smiled instead. It was easier than fighting. "Of course," I said quietly. "Order is good." My hand trembled as I placed the kettle back on the stove. The veins stood out against my skin, thin and blue like rivers drying in the Sunday. It startled me how fragile my hands looked. Hands that had built meals, stitched clothes, written lessons for generations of students. Now, they shook from the weight of silence. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every sound felt amplified: the hum of the fridge, the faint click of the thermostat, the distant rhythm of their laughter below. I used to be part of that rhythm. Now it pulsed without me, indifferent to whether I joined or not. I thought of Thomas again, of his voice reading in that deep, steady way that filled a room. I used to tell him he gave the house a soul. Without him, it was just walls and wires. Without me, it was a showroom. I realized then that I had been erased long before Madison spoke those words in the kitchen. This was not sudden exile. It was slow erosion. Every compromise, every apology, every quiet meal alone had carved me smaller until there was almost nothing left. People think ghosts are born from tragedy. I think they're born from neglect. You don't have to die to disappear. You just have to stop being seen. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamt of Thomas's chair again. In the dream, it sat in the middle of the living room, uncovered, bathed in morning light. Ryan was a boy again, drawing on the floor, his crayons rolling beneath the legs of the chair. I reached for him, but when he looked up, his face wasn't his own. It was Madison's, smiling that thin smile that erased everything it touched. I woke up gasping, my heart hammering in the quiet. The house was still. The world outside was wrapped in fog. I went to the window and pressed my palm to the glass. The reflection staring back at me was pale, blurred, almost translucent. That was when I realized I had become a ghost in my own home. A mother who cooked for others, paid their bills, watched their children, and yet moved through rooms like a shadow. I wasn't living there anymore. I was haunting it. And ghosts, I decided, do not ask for permission to stay. They wait. They remember. They find their moment to return to life. The morning it happened was quiet, deceptively so. The kind of silence that feels clean at first, like a blank page, until you realize something has already been erased. I woke before dawn, as I often did, and went to make coffee. The house was still dark, the air cool enough to make my fingers ache as I reached for the kettle. The kitchen felt different lately, too polished, too arranged. Every surface smelled faintly of Madison's lemon-scented cleaner, which masked the scent of home. I missed the faint aroma of cinnamon and old wood that used to linger in the mornings. As the water boiled, I noticed a letter on the counter, half hidden under the mail pile. The envelope bore the familiar green logo of Willow Creek Savings and Loan. I frowned. I hadn't expected any correspondence from them. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. When I opened it, the words on the page didn't make sense at first, as though I were reading someone else's problem. Notice of mortgage delinquency. Immediate attention required. I read it again, slower this time, then again, until the letters blurred into each other. The paper trembled in my hands. My house, the home Thomas and I had owned outright for nearly a decade. How could there be a delinquency notice? The kettle began to whistle. I didn't move. I just stood there, the sound slicing through the numbness in my chest. When the noise became unbearable, I turned it off and set the letter beside my mug. I told myself there had to be some mistake. A clerical error, a typo, something small, fixable. But the dread crawling through me said otherwise. I went upstairs to my room and opened my laptop. The screen's cold blue light reflected in the window, casting a faint shimmer across my face. My hands shook as I typed in my login credentials. When the account summary appeared, I felt my breath catch. The joint savings account where my retirement checks were automatically deposited each month had been drained. The line item read, "Transfer to Household Maintenance Fund, authorized by R. Hayes." Ryan's name. I scrolled through the history. The withdrawals were systematic, quiet, spread out over weeks. Not enough to raise suspicion at once, but steady enough to drain the life out of a lifetime's savings. A tightness gripped my chest. I leaned back in my chair, the glow from the screen turning my tears silver. Maintenance fund, that was what they called it. I remembered the conversation clearly now. It had been on a Tuesday evening, months ago. Madison had been rearranging the pantry labels again, while Ryan stood at the counter, balancing a spreadsheet on his tablet. "Mom, I think it'd be easier if we just manage the bills together," he'd said gently. "You know, consolidate things, make sure nothing gets missed." I'd nodded without thinking. I had trusted him, he was my son. And now, staring at the empty account, I realized that I had been financing my own disappearance. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to steady myself. The first betrayal had been emotional, a slow erosion of space and respect. This one was different. This one had weight. It was theft, masked as responsibility. I thought of Madison's new car, her salon trips, the luxury brand boxes that had started arriving in stacks at the front door. I had told myself she must be saving from her part-time job, that appearances could be deceiving. They were. My fingers brushed against the edge of the desk, where the leather notebook still lay open from the night before. I flipped to a new page and began writing. It wasn't enough to feel the pain. I needed to record it, to name it, to make it real. They are taking the roof from over my head and calling it maintenance. The act of writing steadied my breathing. My mind began to sharpen. For the first time in months, the fog was clearing. That was when I remembered the envelope. It had been years since I'd seen it. A plain brown packet tucked at the bottom of the dresser drawer, beneath old tax files and faded photographs. Thomas had labeled it in his steady handwriting, Plan B. I had never opened it. He'd given it to me a few weeks before he passed, pressing it into my hands with a small smile. "Just in case," he'd said. "You always like to be prepared, Ellie. So do I." At the time, I thought it was something sentimental, maybe a letter, or his insurance paperwork. I'd promised him I'd only open it if I ever truly needed to. I think he would have called this a need. I pulled the packet from the drawer and sat on the bed, the paper soft from age. Inside was a single folded letter and a few documents. My throat tightened when I saw his handwriting again. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are facing something I wish I could protect you from. Life has a way of testing gentle people twice, first through grief, then through betrayal. I don't know who or what will try to take what we built, but I do know this. Never sign away what you built with your own hands. Not the house, not the savings, not the peace we worked for. If anything ever feels wrong, trust that feeling. Keep copies of everything, and remember, The law can be cruel, but it listens when truth is documented. Yours, always, Thomas. I read the letter 3 times before I could breathe again. His words felt like a hand on my shoulder, steadying me in the darkness. For months I had been drowning in politeness, in the quiet hope that things would fix themselves if I stayed kind enough. But Thomas had known better. He had known that kindness without boundaries is just another kind of surrender. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the notebook. Downstairs, I heard footsteps. Ryan's voice drifted up from the living room, followed by Madison's laughter. My heart clenched. I couldn't confront them yet, not without proof, not without strength. But the Eleanor they thought they could outsmart was gone. I turned back to the laptop, taking screenshots, printing statements, creating a small folder of evidence. Each click was an act of reclamation. By the time the sun rose, the folder was full, and my resolve was solid. They had taken my money, my space, and my voice, but they had not taken my mind. I looked once more at Thomas's letter. Never sign away what you built. I whispered the words aloud, tasting the steel in them. That morning, for the first time in nearly a year, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and watched the light spread across the kitchen floor. The day felt sharper, clearer. They thought they were managing my life. They were wrong. They had just awakened the woman who once built an entire home from nothing but love and willpower. And now, I would build again, but this time, I would build my freedom. I hadn't planned to see anyone that day. After what I discovered in the bank statements, I wanted only silence, a place to breathe, to think, to let the tremor inside me settle. But the silence in that house wasn't peace. It was suffocation. Every sound reminded me that they were still there, living comfortably on what I had built. So, I left. I didn't take the car. I needed the walk. The morning air in Willow Creek was crisp, touched with the faint sweetness of maple leaves beginning to turn. I walked slowly, past the old library, past the row of antique stores that always smelled faintly of cedar and nostalgia. By the time I reached Grace's Corner Bakery, the bell above the door chimed like a familiar voice. Grace Bennett had been my friend for nearly 30 years. We had sung together in the choir at St. Luke's, shared casseroles after Sunday service, and held each other's hands at more funerals than we cared to count. She was the kind of woman who carried warmth in her eyes even when her heart was breaking. The bakery smelled like safety cinnamon, butter, and apple pie fresh from the oven. She looked up from behind the counter, her silver hair pinned neatly, her apron dusted with flour. "Eleanor Hayes," she said softly, wiping her hands on a towel. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." I tried to smile. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's done the same." She gestured to the small table by the window. "Sit. I'll bring you tea." I sank into the chair, my body heavy with a kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. The window beside me framed the quiet street, the trees bowing under the first hint of autumn. It was the kind of scene that should have felt peaceful. Instead, it made my chest ache. Grace returned with 2 cups of chamomile tea and a small plate of apple scones. She sat across from me, her hand steady as she stirred her cup. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was gentle this time, kind. "Finally," she said, "tell me what happened." I hesitated. For months I had kept it all inside, convincing myself it wasn't that bad, that I was overreacting. But something about the way she asked, without pity, without judgment, broke the dam I had built inside myself. "They've taken everything, Grace." My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. "Not just the money. The house feels like it's no longer mine. My son barely looks at me. My daughter-in-law," I swallowed. "She told me to leave if I don't like living with them. In my own home." Grace's eyes darkened with quiet fury. "She said that to you?" I nodded. She leaned forward, her voice low but strong. "Eleanor, they didn't just take your money. They took your dignity. But you can take it back." The words hung between us, soft but powerful. Something inside me cracked open. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to see it to see me. Not the polite widow or the quiet mother, but the woman who had been slowly erased. Tears blurred my vision. I tried to blink them away, embarrassed, but Grace reached across the table and took my hand. "You're not weak for crying," she said. "You're strong for surviving." I shook my head. "I don't even know where to start." "Start by remembering who you are," she said simply. She lifted her teacup and handed it to me. "Drink this and remember who you are." The cup was warm against my palms. The scent of chamomile rose softly, gentle, floral, grounding. I took a sip, and for a moment, the noise inside me quieted. I thought being kind was the same as being good, I said after a while. I thought if I was patient and generous, people would love me for it. But maybe I taught them to take. Grace smiled sadly. Kindness without boundaries is just permission for others to use you. You've spent your whole life giving, Eleanor. It's time you learned how to keep. Her words were a mirror, showing me a truth I hadn't wanted to face. I had built a life on gentleness, on compromise, on smoothing every rough edge. But in doing so, I had allowed others to carve away my strength, piece by piece. I looked down at my tea, the steam rising in soft curls. Thomas used to say the same thing. He told me to keep what I built, to protect it. I found his letter again this morning. Grace squeezed my hand. Then maybe that was your sign. He knew this day might come. I think he did, I whispered, and I ignored it. I wanted to believe Ryan would never. I couldn't finish the sentence. The betrayal still felt too raw. Grace waited a moment before speaking. Ryan is your son. You love him, but love doesn't mean blindness. He has to face what he's allowed to happen. You can't protect him from that. Her voice was firm but kind, like a prayer disguised as advice. I sat back, letting her words settle. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the window, scattering leaves across the sidewalk. The movement caught the light just right, and for a brief second, everything shimmered: the trees, the window, the reflection of my face in the glass. For months, I had seen only loss. But now, looking at my reflection, I saw something else beginning to take shape. Resolve. Grace, I said quietly, what would you do if someone tried to take your life away piece by piece? She smiled, small and knowing. I'd start by taking it back one piece at a time. You don't need to fight like they do. You just need to remember you're the one who built the house they're standing in. I nodded slowly. Her words landed deep, grounding me. We sat there until the tea grew cold, watching the world outside shift from morning to noon. When I finally stood to leave, Grace pressed something into my hand, a small sachet of dried chamomile flowers. For when you forget who you are again, she said softly. I held it close, feeling the texture of the petals beneath the thin fabric. It was light, almost weightless, but it carried something heavier than comfort. It carried intention. Walking home, I realized that something inside me had changed. The anger was still there, yes, but beneath it was something stronger, a quiet clarity. Grace was right. They hadn't just taken my money, they had taken my dignity, and I was going to take it back. That evening, I brewed another cup of chamomile tea, the scent filling the air like a memory of warmth. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line across the top of a fresh page. Today, I begin again. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a woman waking from a long, cruel dream, ready to reclaim her story. The next morning arrived pale and cold, the kind of morning that makes you feel as though the world is holding its breath. I stood at the kitchen window with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the sun climb slowly over the line of pine trees at the back of the yard. The house was quiet. Ryan and Madison were still asleep upstairs, unaware that everything they thought they controlled was about to change. The envelope from the bank lay on the counter beside my laptop. The weight of it no longer frightened me. It was simply evidence now, proof of what I already knew. The fear that had once gripped me had been replaced by something calmer, colder, focus. I remembered Grace's words from the bakery. They took your dignity. You can take it back. That was exactly what I intended to do. I opened my notebook and turned to a blank page. At the top, in steady handwriting, I wrote, Plan B. Then I reached for the small envelope Thomas had left behind, unfolding his letter again. His handwriting still steadied me. Never sign away what you built. It was time to act. I found the business card tucked between the pages of my address book. Nora Klein, attorney at law. She had handled the estate after Thomas's passing. A practical woman, sharp as glass but fair. The kind who didn't waste words. I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, her tone brisk and alert even at 8 in the morning. Klein Law Office, Nora speaking. Nora, this is Eleanor Hayes, I said quietly. I'm afraid I need your help. There was a pause. Then her voice softened. Eleanor, of course. How have you been holding up? I've had better weeks, I said. I believe my son and his wife have been withdrawing money from my accounts and may have attempted to refinance my home without my knowledge. Another pause. Longer this time. Do you have documentation? Yes. Bank statements, transfer records, and the deed. Good. Bring them to me. And Eleanor, she added, don't tell them you're contacting me. Not yet. By noon, I was sitting in her office, a small brick building on Main Street, with ivy climbing up the side. Nora looked exactly as I remembered her neatly pressed suit, hair pinned back, glasses that made her seem perpetually unimpressed with the world. She took the papers from me and began reading in silence, flipping through each document with precise, practiced movements. When she finally looked up, her expression had hardened. Mrs. Hayes, your name is still on the deed. 45% of this property is legally yours. They can't sell it, refinance it, or alter ownership without your consent. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. 45%, I repeated, almost tasting the relief. That's right. And from what I can tell, you've also been the primary contributor to the mortgage and upkeep since your husband's death. If they're using your funds for personal expenses, that's misappropriation. She leaned back, steepling her fingers. I assume you want to keep this quiet until you decide your next step? I nodded. For now. I want to understand my position before I confront them. Nora's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then, I'll prepare a motion for a financial audit of the property accounts. It will look routine, nothing that raises suspicion. Meanwhile, start documenting everything: conversations, receipts, any evidence of coercion or disrespect. It helps to build a pattern. Thank you, I said, meaning it. When I left her office, the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in small whirlpools across the parking lot. I clutched Thomas's letter in my coat pocket. For the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless. I felt purposeful. Back at the house, the light had shifted. Afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, cutting the living room into long slivers of gold and shadow. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out the old suitcase, the one Thomas and I had taken on our honeymoon to the Oregon coast. The leather was scuffed now, the handle worn smooth. I carried it upstairs to my room. Every object I packed carried a story. The blue scarf Thomas bought me on our anniversary trip, my mother's brooch, the photo album from Ryan's childhood. I didn't take everything, just what mattered, just what was mine. When I reached the last drawer, I found the wedding photo again. It had been lying face down on the dresser for weeks. I picked it up and studied it under the thin morning light. The glass caught the reflection of my face beside the younger version of myself, the woman in the white dress with laughter in her eyes, unaware of the losses ahead. For a moment, the two versions of me merged in the reflection, one half in shadow, one half in sunlight, the past and the present, the loved and the betrayed. I set the photo carefully on the desk, half in light, half in dark. It seemed fitting. They wanted me gone, I whispered to the woman in the picture. Fine. I'll vanish with what's mine. The sound of my voice startled me. It was steady, deliberate, the voice of someone who had made peace with her own strength. That evening, I moved quietly through the house, noticing every detail I had once ignored: the pile of unopened packages by the door, the faint scent of Madison's perfume lingering in the air, the careless way they had left lights on in empty rooms. It all felt temporary now, like a stage set waiting to be torn down. I returned to my room and opened my notebook again. Beneath Plan B, I began to write steps. Secure financial records. Confirm legal standing. Contact utilities. Prepare exit. Each line steadied me further. The next morning, I withdrew my portion of the remaining funds and transferred them into a private account. I changed the passwords, called the insurance company, and filed the paperwork Nora had prepared. When Ryan and Madison came downstairs, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a calmness that seemed to unsettle them. You're up early, Madison said, pouring herself coffee. Just taking care of a few things, I replied. She smiled, unaware of the ground shifting beneath her. Good for you, I smiled back, but mine was the kind that hid fire. As they left for the day, I glanced once more at the wedding photo on the counter. The sunlight had moved, bathing Thomas's side of the picture in gold, while mine remained in shadow. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger and whispered, "You were right, Thomas. It's time to protect what we built." That night, as the house settled into silence, I placed the packed suitcase beside the door and sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall across the yard. I wasn't leaving out of defeat. I was leaving with intention. The old Eleanor had waited for permission. The new Eleanor moved in silence, guided by purpose. And as dawn began to rise, spilling soft light across the table where the wedding photo rested half in shadow and half in sun, I realized something profound. I was no longer mourning what had been taken. I was preparing to reclaim what was mine. Christmas Eve used to be my favorite night of the year. When Thomas was alive, the house would glow from every corner. The scent of cinnamon and pine needles, the soft crackle of firewood, the faint hum of carols playing from an old record player. We never needed grand decorations, just a few lights, a few candles, and the comfort of knowing that the people sitting around that table loved one another without conditions. But this year, the lights in my house did not feel like warmth. They felt like mockery. Madison had turned the holiday into a performance. 2 weeks before Christmas, she ordered a 12-foot artificial tree, imported ornaments, and a garland that cost more than the mortgage payment she hadn't made in months. She called it aesthetic minimalism. I called it spectacle without soul. I watched her drape the silver ribbons while Ryan adjusted the lights, pretending everything was fine. They never asked what I wanted for Christmas. They never even asked if I'd be home. But I was always there, quiet, present, invisible. That was about to change. The morning of December 24th began like any other. Madison was on the phone discussing catering for her holiday brunch. Ryan was outside, fixing the string of lights that kept short-circuiting. I sat in the kitchen with my tea and my notebook, reading over the letter Nora had sent, confirming the financial transfer. Everything was in place. I had spent the past week moving quietly, methodically. I canceled every automatic payment that came from my accounts. The credit cards with both our names on them were now frozen. The utilities were under my ownership. I had filed a stop service order effective midnight, December 24th. I also mailed a letter that morning, notice of intent to sell property. It was a simple envelope addressed to the county assessor's office, but to me, it felt like a declaration of independence. 45% of that house was legally mine, and by dawn, the whole thing would be on the market. It was almost poetic, really. They wanted me gone. They just never imagined I'd take the roof with me. By evening, the air outside carried the sharp smell of frost. I could hear laughter from the living room. Madison's friends had arrived early for their Christmas toast. The chandelier glowed above them, spilling golden light across the walls. I stood by the staircase, unnoticed, holding Thomas's Plan B envelope in one hand and a single key in the other. It was strange how calm I felt. My heart wasn't racing. My hands didn't shake. The decision had already been made days ago. Tonight was only the execution. At exactly midnight, the power went out. The laughter stopped. The music faded mid-chorus. For a moment, the house was utterly silent except for the faint crackle of the dying fireplace. "What happened?" Madison's voice pierced the darkness. "Ryan, check the breaker." I stood in the doorway of the living room, my figure half illuminated by the fading embers. "It's not the breaker," I said quietly. Madison spun toward me. "What did you do?" "I made some calls," I said. "The accounts you've been using are closed. The utilities, the mortgage, the cards. All of it." Her face twisted in disbelief. You can't do that. It's Christmas." I smiled faintly. "My Christmas gift this year is silence." The room went still. Even Ryan didn't move. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, slow flakes, softening the edges of the night. Inside, the towering Christmas tree stood dark and cold, its glittering ornaments now hollow shapes in the shadows. The illusion had collapsed. The house they had filled with noise and vanity was finally quiet again. "You've lost your mind," Madison hissed. "Do you even know what you've done?" "Oh, I know," I said. "I've reclaimed what was mine. Every penny, every inch, every piece of peace you tried to take from me." Ryan stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Mom, please, let's not do this now." I turned to him, seeing not the man who had betrayed me, but the boy who once begged me to keep the nightlight on because he was afraid of the dark. "I already did it, Ryan. You just never noticed." Madison crossed her arms, but her voice trembled. "You think you can just walk away and we'll be fine?" I picked up my suitcase from the floor and met her gaze. "No, Madison. I think you'll have to learn how to stand on your own." I did it. "So can you." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. I started toward the staircase. The silence followed me like a shadow. Each step creaked underfoot, a soft rhythm that felt like a heartbeat returning after too long. When I reached the landing, I paused and looked back one last time. The living room lay in darkness, the grand tree now nothing more than a silhouette of empty branches. Thomas's photo still sat on the mantel. I could barely make out his smile in the dim light, but I imagined he was watching, nodding in quiet approval. In my room, I placed the Plan B envelope into my bag, next to the notebook and the chamomile sachet Grace had given me. The faint scent of dried flowers still lingered, soothing and steady. Through the window, I could see the snow thickening, blanketing the neighborhood in soft white. Somewhere, carolers were singing faintly in the distance, their voices carried by the wind. The melody felt both sad and comforting, like closure disguised as song. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the stillness settle around me. This wasn't victory in the loud sense of the word. It was quieter, gentler, like breathing after holding your breath too long. Downstairs, Madison's voice rose again, shrill and frantic, but it no longer reached me. Her chaos could not penetrate the calm I had built inside. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same Eleanor who had spent months apologizing for her existence. Her eyes were steady, her mouth firm. I whispered to her, "They wanted me gone. Fine. But I'll leave on my terms." I turned off the small bedside lamp. The last light in the house faded into darkness. It was a silent Christmas Eve. No lights, no carols, no pretense. Just quiet truth. As I lay down, the cold moonlight streamed faintly through the window, landing on the Plan B envelope beside me. Half in shadow, half in light. Exactly like me. If you've ever been treated like a burden, remember this. You still have the power to write your own story. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is turn out the lights and begin again. The plane touched down just after dawn, the soft light of Lisbon spilling across the tarmac like gold silk. I had never been to Portugal before, though Thomas always said we would go one day, when we were older and free from the weight of schedules and obligations. It felt strange to arrive without him, carrying only a single suitcase, a letter from my lawyer, and a notebook that had become my witness. Lucia met me at the airport. She was older than I remembered, her hair a graceful silver, her face warm with the kind of kindness that doesn't need words. She had been Thomas's colleague when he worked in Lisbon years ago, and we had exchanged letters occasionally after his death. When she heard my voice crack over the phone a few weeks ago, she had said simply, "Come, there is space for you here." Her apartment was small but full of light, perched above the Alfama district with a view of the Tagus River. The windows opened wide, and the scent of the sea drifted in, mingling with the distant sound of church bells. From the balcony, I could see the city waking fishermen, unloading crates at the docks, vendors setting up their stalls, and the first tram of the morning winding down the cobblestone street. I felt something shift inside me as I stood there. For months, my world had been heavy, airless. Now it was open, vast. Lucia showed me to a small guest room with pale blue walls and a simple bed. A vase of white daisies sat on the nightstand. "Stay as long as you need," she said in her soft, melodic English. "Here, no one asks who you were, only who you want to be next." That night, I slept without fear for the first time in years. The next morning, I woke to the sound of seagulls and sunlight streaming through the open window. I made tea chamomile, just as Grace had taught me, and sat by the balcony. The city below moved slowly, gently, as if the whole world had agreed to start fresh. I opened my notebook. Its pages were full now. Bank records, pieces of conversation, fragments of pain. I turned to the last filled page, where I had written, "They wanted me gone. Fine. I'll vanish with what's mine." Then, on the next blank page I wrote, "I didn't die. I simply stopped living for those who wanted me gone." The words came easily, almost without thought. My handwriting looked different, firmer, steadier. I closed my eyes and listened. Somewhere nearby, a guitar was playing, soft and slow. A song carried by the sea breeze. I could hear laughter, the faint sound of children chasing one another down the street. There was life here, uncomplicated, unjudging, alive. For so long, I had defined myself by what others needed from me. Mother, wife, caretaker, provider. Every title had been another thread tying me to people who loved the version of me that served them. In losing everything, I had found the one thing I had forgotten to keep myself. Lucia joined me on the balcony later that afternoon. She brought a small plate of pastel de nata, still warm from the oven. We ate in silence, watching the sunlight shimmer on the river. "You look lighter," she said eventually. "I feel new," I said. "Or maybe just awake." She smiled knowingly. "Freedom looks good on you, Eleanor." The word lingered in the air. Freedom. That evening, I took a walk through the narrow streets. The air smelled of salt and roasted chestnuts. Musicians played in the plazas, their melodies floating like prayers between the buildings. Every turn revealed something unexpected. A splash of color on a tiled wall, a cat stretched lazily on a doorstep, a stranger offering a smile with no hidden agenda. When I reached the overlook above the river, the sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind tangle my hair and the warmth sink into my bones. I opened my notebook again and wrote 3 words in large, deliberate letters. Book of Freedom. The old notebook, once filled with confessions and pain, had become something else. A record of rebirth. As I wrote, a gust of wind swept through the balcony, flipping the pages and tugging at the loose sheet where I had written freedom. The paper lifted, caught the light, and fluttered out of my hands. I watched as it danced on the air, twisting, rising, until it drifted out over the water. I didn't chase it. I just watched it go, feeling strangely at peace. For years, I had held on too tightly to memories, to forgiveness, to people who didn't deserve my loyalty. Letting that piece of paper go felt like setting the past itself free. When I returned to Lucia's apartment, the city was glowing under 1,000 soft lights. From the open window, I could see the reflection of those lights rippling across the river like stars scattered on water. I poured myself another cup of tea and looked at my reflection in the glass. My face was lined, yes, but no longer tired. My eyes, once dulled by sorrow, now caught the light. For the first time in a long while, I whispered my own name out loud. Eleanor Hayes. It felt whole again. I thought about everything I had left behind: the darkened house, the angry voices, the weight of being unwanted. None of it followed me here. I wasn't running away anymore. I was walking towards something. In the distance, a church bell chimed. I picked up my pen and wrote one final line before closing the notebook for the night. Every woman deserves a place where she is not invisible. Then I smiled and whispered to the quiet room, I've found mine. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of guitar strings and laughter. And somewhere, far across the Atlantic, the house I had once called home stood in darkness. But here, in this city of light and salt and renewal, I had found something far more powerful than revenge. I had found peace. The morning began with the sound of the ocean brushing softly against the shore below the apartment. The rhythm of it had become my clock, steady and unchanging, as if the sea itself was keeping time for my new life. I brewed a cup of tea and opened the balcony doors to let in the cool air. The city below was waking up slowly, church bells in the distance, the faint hum of trams, the chatter of vendors setting up their stalls. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Almost everything that reached me these days came from a world I had chosen to leave behind. But curiosity won, and I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Ryan. "Mom, you ruined us." The words sat there, plain and sharp, as if carved into the glass. I stared at them for a long time, waiting for the old instinct to rise, the guilt, the ache, the need to explain. But nothing came. There was no rush of panic, no desperate urge to make things right, only quiet understanding. I hadn't ruined him. I had released him. I put the phone down and turned to my laptop. A new email notification glowed at the top of the screen. It was from Nora. I opened it, my hands steady, my breathing even. Subject: Update on property sale. Eleanor, the house sale has gone through successfully. Your 45% has been transferred to your private account. Attached are the documents for your records. Congratulations on reclaiming what's yours. I read the message twice, then once more, letting the finality of it sink in. The house that had once been my prison was no longer mine to worry about. It no longer belonged to those who treated me as invisible. It was just a structure, now wood and stone and empty rooms echoing with the ghosts of voices that used to silence me. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. A soft breeze carried the scent of the river through the open window. I thought of Thomas, of Grace, of all the people who had helped me remember my worth when I had almost forgotten it. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Grace. "They talked about you at Street Luke's today. Your story. I didn't use names, but the women knew. They said they felt seen for the first time in years. One of them left her son's house last night. Another called a lawyer. "You've started something, Eleanor." I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the warmth of it spread beneath my skin. For months, my story had been something I carried like a burden, a secret too painful to say out loud. But here it was, spreading beyond me, reaching other women, sparking something awake in them. Grace's message ended with a single line that made me close my eyes. "You spoke for us when we couldn't." Outside, the bells began to ring again, long, clear notes that rolled over the rooftops and across the river. They sounded like both mourning and rebirth. I thought of Ryan again, of his message and the sadness beneath it. Perhaps one day he would understand. Perhaps not. Love does not always mean staying. Sometimes it means letting someone face the consequences of what they have built. I opened my notebook, the Book of Freedom, and turned to a fresh page. My handwriting had grown steadier since Lisbon, my thoughts clearer. I wrote, "Sometimes one woman's no becomes another's salvation." The phrase lingered on the page like a whisper I had been waiting to hear for a lifetime. I took a sip of tea and let my gaze drift to the city below. The people moving along the narrow streets, the elderly women chatting at the corner cafe, the mothers guiding their children to school, each one carrying stories of sacrifice, resilience, and quiet endurance. It struck me then how many of us lived half-lives, shrinking ourselves so others could feel larger. How many of us mistook patience for peace and silence for safety. That illusion had cost me years. But what if my small act of defiance, turning off the lights, walking away, reclaiming my voice, could show others a way out of their own shadows? I opened Grace's message again and smiled. The thought of those women at Street Luke's made my chest swell with something that felt like pride and sorrow intertwined. I had thought my story was ending when I left Willow Creek. But now I saw it differently. That was only the end of a chapter. The beginning had been waiting here, across the ocean, in the light of a new day. Lucia came into the room then, humming softly. She carried a basket of oranges from the market, their bright color catching the sunlight. "You look peaceful," she said, setting them on the table. "I feel it," I replied, "for the first time in a very long while." She smiled. "Peace suits you, but I suspect you're not done yet." She was right. Peace was never the end of the story. It was the foundation for what comes next. Later that evening, I walked to the edge of the river. The sky was painted in shades of lavender and gold, and the water reflected it like glass. I thought of the small ripple that begins when a stone touches the surface, how it grows, widening, moving outward until it reaches far beyond where it began. That was what truth did when spoken aloud. It did not shout, it did not demand, it simply moved. As I stood there, the wind caught my hair, and I whispered to the river, "I am not gone, I am finally here." The water shimmered in response, as if it understood. Back at the apartment, I sent a message to Grace. "Tell them thank you for listening, and tell them it's never too late to be seen." Then I posted a letter online, a short essay under my own name. I titled it, "The Price of Silence." It was only a few paragraphs long, about what it means to be erased in your own home and to rebuild yourself one quiet choice at a time. I didn't expect anyone to notice, but by the next morning, messages began to arrive from women in Texas, in Ontario, in Dublin. Each one began the same way. "Your story is my story too." I read every message. Each one felt like a thread, weaving me into something larger than myself. A community of women who had lived through their own versions of my house, my silence, my awakening. I closed my laptop and whispered into the Lisbon morning. Maybe this was the purpose all along. Kindness had never been my weakness. It had been my strength, buried beneath years of compromise. Now, it had become something new, proof that even broken voices can echo across oceans. If you believe that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, tell us where you are watching from. We are listening. We are here. And together, we are louder than silence. The morning light in Lisbon has a way of finding every corner, even the quiet ones. It slips through the curtains like a soft confession, illuminating the air itself. I have come to love that light. It feels like forgiveness. It has been nearly 6 months since I left Willow Creek. 6 months since I turned off the lights in a house that no longer felt like mine, and boarded a plane with one suitcase, one notebook, and one promise to live again. But this time, on my own terms. Life in Lisbon has taken on a rhythm that feels both new and familiar. Mornings with tea and the hum of trams below. Afternoons spent walking along the river, watching the fishermen cast their lines into the wide, forgiving water. Some evenings, I meet Lucia at the cafe across the street, where she insists the espresso tastes better if you drink it slowly. I listen to stories of her childhood, and she listens to mine. We are both women who have lost and rebuilt, and in that shared silence, we find something sacred. But today feels different. Today, there is a letter to write. It is addressed to two names that still live close to my heart, my grandchildren, Ella and Noah. They are too young now to understand the complexity of what happened, too innocent to see the fractures that ran through our family. But one day, they will ask. And I want the story they hear to come from me, not from whispers twisted by guilt or shame. I open my notebook, the one that has traveled with me through grief and awakening. The brown leather cover is worn now, soft at the edges. Inside are the traces of every moment that changed me. Tears, ink stains, words that once trembled with fear and now stand firm with clarity. I dip my pen in ink and begin. My dear Ella and Noah, if you are reading this, you are old enough to understand that love is not always gentle, and truth is not always kind. There was a time when I believed that being good meant saying yes, even when it hurt. That kindness meant surrender, that forgiveness meant forgetting. I was wrong. Real love does not mean giving until you disappear. It means stopping before you lose yourself. It means knowing when silence becomes complicity, and when leaving is the purest form of love left to give. One day, you will face people who will test your boundaries, who will tell you that your worth depends on how much you can endure. I want you to remember me then, not as the grandmother who was quiet, but as the woman who finally said no. I pause, letting the ink dry, watching the words settle into the page like roots into soil. Writing this letter feels like closing a door and opening a window at the same time. The curtain lifts as a gust of wind enters the room, carrying with it the scent of salt and morning bread from the street below. I can hear a guitarist playing somewhere in the distance, the melody faint but warm. I take a sip of my tea chamomile, always, and glance at the cup. Its surface reflects the sunlight, shimmering like liquid gold. On the table beside me lies a small stack of envelopes. Letters from women I have never met, but who somehow know me. One from Michigan, another from Dublin, one from Hanoi. Each begins the same way. Your story gave me courage. Some have sent photographs, faces of grandmothers standing in their gardens, of mothers holding hands with their grown daughters, of women smiling in apartments they finally own. It humbles me to realize that my quiet rebellion, once an act of desperation, has become a small beacon for others. I used to think freedom was an escape. Now, I know it is an arrival. As the morning grows brighter, I write one last line in my notebook. I didn't walk away. I walked home to myself. I set the pen down and look out the window. The Tagus River glitters below, sunlight dancing on its surface like tiny sparks of possibility. Lisbon stretches beyond it, vast and alive, a city that hums with both history and hope. I imagine Thomas beside me, smiling that patient smile of his, the one that used to make even silence feel safe. You did it, he would say. You found your way back. And I did. Not to a place, but to a truth. That a woman's worth does not fade with time, and her story does not end when others stop listening. The tea grows cold beside me, but I don't mind. The warmth now comes from within the steady pulse of something that had been buried and is now awake again. When I step onto the balcony, the world below greets me with open arms. The air tastes like freedom, sharp and clean. The rooftops glimmer in the rising sun, and the city seems to breathe along with me. I think about all the women who will one day sit at their own windows, tea in hand, deciding that today is the day they stop apologizing for existing. I think about my grandchildren, who will grow up knowing that kindness is not weakness and that their voices deserve to be heard. Maybe that is the legacy I leave behind, not money, not a house, but a map for finding your way home when the world tries to erase you. As the church bells begin to ring in the distance, I whisper softly, "This is not the end, it's the beginning." The morning light fills the room, flooding the pages of my notebook, spilling across the floor like a gentle tide. I close my eyes and let it touch my face. For the first time, I feel completely at peace, not because I have escaped my past, but because I have finally made peace with it. The last page of my story glows under the Lisbon sun, the ink still glistening as if alive. And in that light, I see it clearly. The woman I used to be is gone. The woman I am now is free. And she is finally, truly, home. Ending message, epilogue, and call to action. Every story we tell here at Grandma's Final Chapter carries a heartbeat, a reminder that it is never too late to stand up, to heal, and to begin again. Eleanor's journey was not just about reclaiming a house, it was about reclaiming her soul. And maybe, somewhere in her story, you heard an echo of your own. If you have ever been silenced, forgotten, or told that your time has passed, know this: your voice still matters. Your story still has power. And when you share it, you give others permission to do the same. So take a moment, tell us your story in the comments. Let the world hear you. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter to receive our next story of courage, love, and rebirth. Together, we keep the light alive, one story, one voice, one truth at a time.